Denver. Zhao Shenshong has been trying to get me here for too long, and I'm so glad to be here tonight. Who noticed what Madeleine Albright was wearing on her shoulder? Snake, because this is the year of the snake, and that was not a do not tread on me American snake. That was a Chinese snake. I've got the year of the horse in my presentation. That's next year, because I'm trying to take a little look into the future about China and talk about 6 dragons, if you will, that I believe are imperiling China's future. And a common theme will run through this about how I think China can more successfully address and deal with these dragons, and also why the United States should be a partner in that effort. I don't want to bore you with a long presentation, so I'm going to zip through some of this and I'm going to skip some of this so we can get into a dialogue. In full disclosure, I did work at the State Department reporting to Madeleine Albright when she was UN ambassador. And I edited a publication for her about multilateral peacekeeping in the United Nations. And having said that, I don't always agree with Secretary Albright, and you will see that we have some points of disagreement tonight. I think she is much too optimistic about China's future. I think she's also too optimistic about the future of U.S.-China relations. And I say that as a person who first went to China in 1984 as a foreign student. I've made more than 60 trips to China. I've been to every province of China, including Tibet, on several occasions, leading human rights delegations for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for my old bosses, Biden and Kerry. But when she talks about the importance of the human rights issues in China and how Americans traveling to China should raise those issues, she leaves out an important point, which is that Americans, for instance, working for Amnesty International, are not allowed to go to China. So it's nice to talk about the importance of raising human rights issues directly with the Chinese. If you try to do it, depending on where you sit, you may not always have success. I won't bore you with Amnesty's credo, but basically, Amnesty International is not about American values. We're about supporting universal human rights, and this is something I try to educate my Chinese friends about. It's not about promoting democracy or any one system of government, which gives us a certain moral advantage when we do talk to the Chinese, and I do. I talk to the Chinese all the time. I am a Zhongguo Zhong. I've been dealing with China for 30 years, and I still have a lot of old friends there. And I hope that, in fact, I will be allowed to visit China wearing my Amnesty hat for the first time later this year. When I do that, it will be a rare event for Amnesty International to be allowed to visit China at all. The country that shall not be named, we all know what its name is. Voldemort. No, I'm sorry. It's China. It's the People's Republic of China. China should not be a taboo topic. Neither should the human rights issues be a taboo topic. I agree with Secretary Albright. The rise of China is without a doubt the defining event of the world that we live in. It's going to continue to shape the world for my daughters and my daughters' daughters and sons. It is epical in its scope. There's nothing that compares. The U.S. response to China has mostly been in 3 phases. The first one, welcoming and facilitating. Here I'm talking about the period of Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, where China was emerging from isolation of the Cultural Revolution. The Kaifeng period, reform and opening up. And America, our response was a little bit like a sort of cute panda bear. Oh, you're very cute. Welcome to the world. We want you to join us. And there was nothing threatening about this China. In fact, this China was our friend. Now, exploiting and capitalizing, Bill Clinton began to realize, hey, they're not just a tiny little economy. They're growing. The panda bear's growing up, and there's money to be made. And let's have most favored nation status, and let's work together on global issues, and let's confront, here we were confronting the Soviet Union, but now let's work to shape the post-Cold War world. This is very exciting. There's things that we can do together. And then suddenly, that panda bear grew up, and it began to make us very nervous, and we began to hedge our bets. So, answer me these 3 questions. What? Oh, I'm sorry. That's who gets the Monty Python reference. The airspeed of a coconut-laden swallow. This is the unanswerable question from Monty Python's Holy Grail. It doesn't belong in this slideshow. Next one. Is the U.S. embarked on a more confrontational path? Madeleine Albright spoke about the pivot. I think the pivot calls to mind only, and by the way, it is the pivot. It's not the rebalancing, right? The rebalancing expression is the expression that the State Department coined after the Chinese objected to the word pivot. Oh, you don't like the word pivot? We'll call it rebalancing. But what you need to know about the word the pivot, it was the construct of a friend of mine, a colleague at the State Department who was in charge of East Asian affairs. And it came to his mind, I presume, when he was standing on the deck of the battleship Missouri. Because a pivot is what you do with artillery. And you pivot the guns from the port side of the boat to the starboard side of the boat. The pivot is not what Kevin McHale does in the low post playing basketball, although he was very good at it. This is a military pivot. How do we know that it's a military pivot? Because can anyone name me something about the pivot that is actual, is real? Does anyone remember any of the components? I'll tell you the only two things I can remember. Marines going to Darwin and literal combat ships going to Singapore. So if you're going to have a pivot to Asia, one presumes that it would have cultural, economic, political dimensions to it. Oh wait, there is an economic dimension. Madeleine Albright mentioned it, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. How does that relate to China? It relates in one important way. China will never, ever be a member. Right? Because they don't qualify. And they're not going to qualify. Because their market's not open, their labor market's not free, they don't meet any of the standards. So the pivot, to me, let's call it what it is, all right? It's a hedging response. It's not a warm, engaging response. Will human rights issues ever trump traditional strategic issues of security and trade? I'm in the human rights business now, but I spent 25 years trying to balance all of the different U.S. interests that were going on in Asia. And so I was always in the business of integrating human rights into the broader interests. I don't think that human rights will ever trump these traditional hard power issues. To be honest, don't tell Amnesty, probably the human rights should not trump these issues. But I believe that the human rights issues color everything else that we are thinking about when we think about China. Because who's aware of India's great military rise? No one talks about India's military rise. Because India is a democracy that doesn't have a one-party state, that respects the human rights of its own citizens better than China does. Right? So it's not the mere fact of China's military rise that is troubling to us, is it? It's the fact that that is taking place in a society where we have some pretty profound human rights concerns. And the same is true of economics. No one talks about Brazil's economic rise as if it was a great threat to the United States. All right. Third question in my mind is, will rising China middle class try to renegotiate the social contract? This is the underlying premise of a lot of the engagement approach. An engagement approach I strongly agree with China, is that through engagement we help to cultivate a middle class in China. The middle class then aspires to take a greater say in their own governance. And in doing so, helps to promote political liberalization and democratization in China. I think the question is an open question, because there are now about 250 million Chinese middle class, and for the most part they have been very conservative in their political aspirations so far. There are some assumptions about China that may lack truthiness. One is that China will sustain robust economic growth. I think no country will grow at 10% forever. Another is that the Communist Party will remain cohesive and united. I think we see in Bo Xilai case out in Sichuan evidence that the party is not completely well. Another assumption out there is that China will maintain adequate social stability. There are thousands of events of social unrest in China every year. We know this from China's own reporting. But so far they have not, since 1989, fundamentally threatened the security of the state. I think we may be approaching another 1988 circumstance. And finally, the idea of Taiwan remaining trapped in China's orbit. I'll be happy to answer questions about Taiwan tonight. Madeleine Albright didn't talk about it, which is pretty interesting because for the vast majority of U.S. relations with China, Taiwan has been either the number one or the number two most important issue, which has bedeviled the relationship. I once had a meeting with Li Jiaxing, the gentleman she mentioned. He was foreign minister, he was an ambassador to the United States. He's an amazing guy, he's a poet, he's a scholar, he's trained 3 generations of Chinese diplomats. And I was showing off. I'm a little bit of a braggart. And I was saying to Li Jiaxing in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, I said, you know, at this point he was at the National People's Congress. I said, you know, Chairman Li, I'm very proud of the fact that I've been to every province of China. And he said, well, he says, you know that I have been to every state in the United States, which I did not know, and which I have not been to. And then, just for the kicker, he says, I have also been to every province in China, except one, Taiwan. This issue is still very much on China's radar. It should be on our radar, even though everything seems to be copacetic right now. There's no guarantee that it's going to remain that way. And if this issue blows up in our face, it's the one issue in my mind, not the South China Sea. It's the one issue that could bring the United States and China into direct military conflict. The parameters of China's rise, we know these, we can run through them quickly. The massive economic growth, China replacing the U.S. as the largest trading nation on the planet. Chinese banks, 7 of the top banks in the world are Chinese now. 10 years ago, that would have been American banks. Now the 7 of the top 10 capitalized banks are Chinese. Modernity is everywhere in China. How many have been to China? Raise your hand. Outstanding. I have a great educated audience. You know that the modernity is not just in Beijing, it's not just in Shanghai, it's in Gansu, it's in Xining, it's in Lanzhou, it's in the deepest backwaters of China. They have more miles of grade A superhighway than the United States now. By the way, they have about half the territory of the United States, right? But they have more miles of really good superhighway than we do. More than 120,000 Chinese students enrolled in the U.S. They are enriching our universities intellectually and also financially. Thank you, China. And Confucius Institutes springing up around the world, which I think is a wonderful thing, but is a sign of China's growing soft power. You know, these institutes around the world educating people about Chinese language and history and culture. So, I mean, Pudong. When I first visited Shanghai, that was rice paddies, the Beijing Olympics, the high-speed rail. You know, you've seen these images, but you know, until you've ridden on one of these bullet trains in China, 29 minutes from Beijing to Tianjin. I did that trip with Senator Kerry. Smooth as silk, 200 miles an hour, conventional rail. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I get on the train every day from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. I ride on a 40-year-old rail car on 100-year-old tracks. It takes me an hour and 10 minutes to go 36 kilometers. They go 120 kilometers in 29 minutes for $7. Largest air terminal in the world, T3 in Beijing. The highways you spoke about. Look at, I mean, you know, even through the mountains, it's unbelievable. It's also matched by a military rise. And Madeleine Albright, you know, she glossed over this a little bit. Let me say flat out, China is not our peer competitor in the military. And they're not going to be our peer competitor for quite some time. But they sure are in the rearview mirror, you know, coming up fast. So a decade of sustained 15 to 20% budget growth, modern military doctrine. They are training now much more like they would fight in a modern war. And they have some of the most modern equipment now that they're rolling out that is beginning to be on a par with American equipment. I used to be a military analyst. It's how I started my career in the U.S. government. So I'm not alarmist about China's military rise. A cousin of mine was commander of a U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer, and he used to boast that he thought that his one ship, the USS John McCain, could probably put most of the Chinese Navy in the drink single-handedly. And probably he was speaking the truth when he said that. But that was 8 or 9 years ago, and the balance is shifting. So you can just see a little bit of the hardware. This is the Russian Varyag aircraft carrier that they refurbished. Israeli copied airborne early warning. Soviet copied Sukhoi fighter aircraft. Russian copied ballistic missile submarines. American copied road mobile ICBMs, solid fuel. This is not your grandfather's Chinese military. So what comes next? Again, I don't think China's rise will be perpetual. I think this trouble lies ahead. And go ahead. And I think that the trouble will come in 6 forms, and that's what I'd like to discuss with you tonight in Q&A. The first is the environment. I cannot go to Beijing anymore. I was a student there in '84. I could ride my bicycle from Baiduizi in the northwest part of the city down to Tiananmen Square and not pass a single private automobile on empty roads underneath blue skies that were there every day unless the Gobi Desert sand was blowing in. I cannot arrive in Beijing now at the airport without getting a cough. I cannot stay longer than 3 days without falling sick. I will not live there. I will not put my children there. They estimate that living in Beijing is the equivalent of smoking 3 packs a day, and it takes 5.5 years off your life. So imagine if you're a smoker, you got to start with 3 packs a day, and then if you smoke a pack a day, you're up to 4. That's just living in Beijing. 50% of the groundwater is unusable. Energy. It's very nice that China wants to work with the United States to reduce carbon emissions. I wish them a lot of luck. China relies 70% plus on energy for coal, and it's dirty coal, and they're not slowing down. And I say that with all due respect to China, because China is investing more in wind turbines, more in hydro, more in nuclear, more in renewables than we are. They're doing everything humanly possible, but their energy consumption is growing so fast that it's not nearly enough. Not nearly enough. Last year, China's carbon footprint grew by an amount equal to the total emissions of Japan, which is the world's 4th largest carbon emitter. That was just the amount of the growth of China's CO2 emissions. So it's like adding a Japan every year, right, to the global carbon footprint. They will kill the planet. All right, next. Demographics. China, Madeleine Albright spoke about this. China is getting old. 1 family, 1 child. It used to be the Social Security was guaranteed by the family, no longer true. Big social problem looming with 480 million retirees by the year 2050. Income inequality. If you like, Buffett comparisons to the worker at Walmart, you'd love China, because we make China look, how do I put it? Yeah, by comparison, we are an egalitarian utopia compared to China. Gone are the days of income equality in China. China is now one of the most income unequal places on the planet. And it's not just that they have more billionaires than we do. They do. It's not just that the average net worth of the National People's Congress members, all 4,500 of them, surpasses the average net worth of the American Congress. They make about $1,000 a year salary. So figure me how all 4,500 of them are multi-millionaires. It's also that the provinces are unequal. So that the richest provinces along the coast, the trading provinces, have 10 times the per capita income of the poorest provinces on the interior. And just to give you a sense of that, in the United States, the biggest gap is become where I live in Maryland, we're number 1. And Mississippi, number 50. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. in wealth. But in China, it's 10 to 1. And it's one of the sources of social unrest and tension. And ethnic unrest. So, my friends in China like to tell me that, China has no minority problems because China welcomes all 56 nationalities and everyone's equal and so on. But the truth is that the Hanzu, the Han nationality, if you will, enjoy a privileged position in China. And part of it's through discrimination toward minorities. Part of it's just kind of inherited status and wealth and education and advantages. Some of it is cultural and the value that the Han have placed on education and performing well in the Confucian system. There are lots of different reasons. It's complex. It's not all because of government perfidy. I mean, the government has done a lot to try to improve the situation for minorities, and all kinds of preferences on education and the set-asides on the one-family, one-child policy and so on. My point only is that in a nation that's 90% Han, that still leaves about 130 million minorities. Right? So just the numbers game of China means that even if it's only 10% minorities, it's not a small problem if many of them are unhappy. And many of them are unhappy. Especially the Uyghur, the Muslim ethnic minorities in the northwest of China, who occupy a landmass that's about 20% of China, including all of its uranium ore and its oil. And the Tibetans, who occupy not just a magical, mystical wonderland called Tibet, but if water is the next oil, Tibet is the next Saudi Arabia. Right? Tibet is the headwaters of the 7 great rivers of Asia. The Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Huanghe, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Salween, the Mekong. Right? All those rivers rise in Tibet. All the downstream peoples are starved for water, as is China. So Tibet is of enormous strategic importance, in addition to being a human rights issue. Oh, and finally, corruption. The corruption is off the charts in China. It mostly takes the form of high-level corruption. And what's remarkable about corruption in China, it's very different than like corruption in the Philippines. Corruption in the Philippines goes this way. World Bank comes in, loans Philippines $50 million to build a road in Mindanao. 10 years later, the $50 million is gone, and there's no road. There's not even a trace of where the road was supposed to be. Corruption in China, State Construction Bank loans the province $50 million to build a road. Party boss pockets $5 million and invests it in a villa in France. Then he conscripts forced labor and manages to build the road not for $45 million that remain, but for $38 million, realizing a $7 million profit that he dispenses to his party friends around the province, as well as to his superior officers, as well as giving a kickback to the China Construction Bank in the first place. And at the end of the day, they got a beautiful road. And the province economically prospers from the beautiful road. And the provincial official and his children get to pay cash tuition when they go to Harvard. Right? There is corruption, but it's very productive corruption. The country functions. Things get done, roads get built, airports get constructed, railroads run on time. So,